Welcome, everyone. My name is Ashley Callister, Investment Lead at NorthX Climate Tech. I am so excited to welcome you today to this webinar discussing our most recent report, Biocarbon Rising from Concept to Commercialization. I'm joined today by our partners at ESMIA, Anna Cybulsky and Kathleen Vaillancourt, who will be taking us through these findings. Next slide. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We recognize their deep, ongoing relationship to these lands, not just as stewards, but as innovators in sustainable land and resource practices since time immemorial. As we discuss the future of biocarbon and low-carbon innovation, we invite you to consider how these efforts intersect with Indigenous knowledge systems, land stewardship, and community self-determination. Commercialization is not just about scaling technologies, it's about doing so in a way that is just, inclusive, and grounded in place, and the opportunity of biocarbon lies not only in its technical potential, but also in how thoughtfully and equitably we pursue it. So with that in mind, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. Next slide. As an agenda for today, I will start with a brief overview of NorthX Climate Tech, our process, and our interest in the biocarbon space. I'll then hand it over to our partners at ESMIA to introduce their organization and walk through the report process and key findings, including the technology fundamentals, market opportunities, decarbonization potential, and action plan. And as a note, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our website. And as we go through the content, we encourage you to submit any questions using the Q&A function. We've reserved time at the end of the session for discussion, and we will address all questions at that point. And before we dive in, I'd like to just take 30 seconds to invite attendees to let us know where you are joining us from today. The report has seen a lot of interest, so we're just curious as to where the audience is located. So if you select one of those three options, we'll just leave it open maybe for 10 more seconds here, and then we get to know the audience a little bit better as well. Perfect. Okay, wow, so it looks like we have a great spread. I'm not sure that everyone can see the results, but majority in BC, but quite a few actually outside of BC and some even outside of Canada. So that really just goes to show the widespread interest in this topic, which is fantastic, and the applicability of these findings, not just within BC, but in other places as well. So we can head over to the next slide. So just a little bit about NorthX Climate Tech on the next slide there. For those who may not know us, we're an independent not-for-profit organization supported by both the public and the private sectors to catalyze innovation in BC and across Canada. We provide non-dilutive funding to help scale climate-focused hard tech, and we're formally known as the BC Centre for Innovation in Clean Energy, rebranded to NorthX in June, but our mission remains the same, really to support the most game-changing solutions for climate and economic impact. Next slide. So here's just a brief look at our impact to date. So since the fall of 2021, we've invested close to 40 million in climate tech projects, unlocking a total value of 414.5 million in follow-on and additional investment, as well as additional jobs and climate impact as well. Next slide. And here's just a quick snapshot of some of the innovators in our portfolio. You can view the full roster on our website. Nearly 85% of our funding is directed towards startups, and several are already engaged in the biocarbon value chain. We're actively looking to expand this area of our portfolio, and we encourage innovators developing relevant solutions to connect with us. So feel free to reach out after the webinar, but we're really looking forward to hearing what you're working on. Next slide. So our approach is guided by two main mechanisms, funding what is available and funding what is needed. We identify what's available through open intakes, and we determine what is needed through our data-driven intelligence work. So by partnering with leading experts like ESMIA, we're able to pinpoint where innovation and investment are most critical. Previous reports on topics such as methane pyrolysis and carbon dioxide removal have directly informed targeted investments and strategic expansions to our portfolio. And as part of the process, we also undertake copious stakeholder interviews and engagement, and really appreciate the insights of those thought leaders who contributed to shaping the report. So some of which I know are online today. So thank you so much. Next slide. So this leads us to the topic of today's webinar. We partnered with ESMIA to undertake this report focused on the potential of biocarbon in BC and beyond, and we're so excited to share the key takeaways with you. Next slide. So at NorthX, we've been considering the relationship between carbon management and bioenergy since inception. Our 2023 carbon management blueprint really laid the foundation by outlining existing biomass solutions, their usage requirements, and their potential for decarbonization and scale. And as we moved from research to real-world applications, we ran a 2023 call for innovation focused on forest residue management, which really highlighted the innovation already underway. Our team was struck by the number of proposals centered on biochar, with innovators across BC working to transform slash pile waste into high-value carbon-rich products. And then building on this knowledge, our 2024 Catalyzing Carbon Dioxide Removal at Scale report focused on the carbon removal potential of biochar and other biomass products. It focused on engineered and hybrid solutions, feedstocks, and their effectiveness for long-term storage. And between the research and the innovation side, it was clear that innovation is happening and markets are developing, but what was missing was really a cohesive sector overview, defining the technology, market, and opportunity for solid, liquid, and gaseous biocarbon. So really the goal of this report is to create transparency around market conditions and investment opportunities to ultimately accelerate the commercialization of the most impactful biocarbon technologies. So I know we have a wide audience on the call today, and we really appreciate your interest in this topic. So before I pass it over to ESMIA for the report results, please take a moment and let us know which segment of the value chain you're representing here today. And if your answer is other, please let us know in the chat your role and your interest in biocarbon. Again, we're curious to get to know you a little bit better. So we'll just leave it up for another maybe 15 seconds there. Okay. Okay, so we have a really wide range. We've got quite a few on the technology provider side, some feedstock, some end user, and quite a few other as well. And we're seeing in the chat that some of that is media, some of that is government policy, so some of that's academia. We're really looking at a wide range today, which is fantastic. And again, really, it just makes it clear that we need a collaborative approach across the value chain in order to maximize impact in this space. Next slide. So now it is my pleasure to pass it over to the fantastic team at ESMIA, Anna Cybulsky, Head of Energy System Integration, and Kathleen Vaillancourt, President and CEO. So Anna, please take it away to introduce ESMIA and kick off our discussion.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm pleased to introduce ESMIA. We are a consulting company specialized in integrated 3E system modeling, covering energy, economy, and the environment. We use a scientific approach guided by sophisticated models and high-quality data to study complex issues such as energy transition and energy security. And our goal is to offer strategic advice to decision makers in the public and private sectors. So I'll be leading you through the presentation today, but I'm also here with Kathleen, who is our President and CEO, who will be ready to answer questions at the end. So to begin with, next slide, please. We're going to start with technology fundamentals. The first question we need to answer is, what is biocarbon? So biocarbon is defined as the solid, liquid, and gaseous products that are generated from anaerobic or anaerobic thermal decomposition of biomass residues. These products can be separated into those categories. And so starting with the solid products, the main one is biochar, but also biocoal or torrefied pellets. So biochar is a long-lasting, porous carbonaceous material that can sequester carbon for relatively long periods of time, over 100 years and up to 1,000 years. And at the same time, it can provide some other material benefits. For example, in soils, it can increase the health and fertility during agricultural use. In terms of liquid products, mainly we speak about bio-oil. Bio-oil can be upgraded and used in combustion applications, for example, to substitute traditional fuels like diesel, gasoline, or jet fuel as a renewable drop-in. It can also be deconstructed into chemical feedstocks. And finally, it can also be injected underground for long-lasting carbon sequestration, which is starting to be developed in certain areas, although the regulatory frameworks for this are less developed in Canada right now. And finally, we have syngas, so the gaseous products. These can also be used in combustion applications, for example, in heating, in industry, and they can also be upgraded and converted into renewable natural gas, which of course has more widespread applications such as in buildings. Biocarbon interest has been growing in the last decade, partially thanks to the IPCC, which highlighted biochar production as a negative emissions technology in 2018. Next slide, please. So here we have a very high-level overview of the biocarbon chain, which is mainly just intended to show the complexity of the end-to-end process. So we already looked briefly at the different types of biocarbon products, and next we're going to discuss some of the technologies and focus in on the feedstocks that are available in BC for the production of biocarbon. So in terms of the main production processes, which you can see listed in the table here, the key differentiators between them are the type of feedstock that they can use, the temperature at which they operate, the heating rate, the residence time, so how long the heat is applied, which can be anywhere from seconds to hours, the product yield, so the different proportion of the three products that we talked about that are produced, as well as, of course, their technology readiness level. Most of these processes do require low feedstock moisture, which often can necessitate drying as a preliminary steps. And on the other hand, it's really the temperatures and the heating rates that are going to determine the main types of outputs that are produced. It's important to note that many of these processes can produce several outputs at the same time, so both solid, liquid, and gaseous as well. And so it's really the proportion of those outputs that's going to vary depending on the process parameters. One key difference that's worth mentioning is for hydrothermal processes. These processes can actually use wet biomass with up to 90% moisture content, so that's really their advantage there. And so they can use different types of second generation biofuel sources like agricultural residues, aquatic biomass, animal manures, and sludges. Finally, gasification is a bit different as well, so to say. So this operates in a controlled amount of air and really at the highest temperatures. And so gasification focuses really more exclusively on the production of syngas itself. One important distinction to make as well might be between torrefaction, which is very similar to pyrolysis, but at the lowest temperatures versus pyrolysis itself. And so to qualify as what is considered biochar versus a biocoal, for example, the European biochar certification and the World Biochar certification agree that only biomass processes that operate between 350 and 1,000 degrees Celsius in a low oxygen environment can create the characteristics of biochar. So next slide, please. So we touched briefly on different types of feedstocks that are needed to produce biocarbon. And generally, there are three main biomass components that are found across these feedstocks, but their proportions can vary depending on the source. So lignin predominantly produces biochar and tends to be found in softwoods, deadwoods, which also contain higher fixed carbon. That is a benefit for biochar production. Meanwhile, cellulose tends to yield more bio-oil or bioethanol for that matter, and tends to be found more in hardwoods. And hemicellulose tends to be found more in agricultural residues, and this favors the production of bio-oil or syngas. The key consideration, as I mentioned before, is the moisture content of the feedstock, because most production processes that are commercialized today do require feedstock moisture content below 10%. And finally, of course, the cost of the feedstock itself is very important to ensure the cost effectiveness of the end products. And so we found that a cost of around $45 to $60 per ton is required in the short to medium term to ensure that biocarbon is competitive. So looking at the different types of feedstocks that are available in high quantities in BC, the first one is co-products from wood processing. So these include wood chips, sawdust, and shavings. And basically, they are different outputs of the pulp and paper mill operations coming from either hardwoods or softwoods. This feedstock is very interesting because it tends to be clean, dry, and has a high carbon content. So it's really excellent for biochar production. Next, we have forest harvest residues. So these are typically logging residues that are left in the forest. They can also be called slash piles. They include as well bark deposits that might accumulate over several years from debarking operations, and bark tends to have a higher lignin content. But the difficulty with these is that higher moisture can reduce efficiency of the processes as well as require more drying at the start. In terms of deadwood, which is the third category here in terms of the available potential, this consists of non-living woody biomass. It includes fallen trees, branches, and so on. And it can also be a result of climate events like forest fires or insect damage that occurred in BC some years ago. The higher lignin and the dryness helps in terms of the production of biocarbon, but they do tend to have a lower energy content. Next, we have construction, renovation, and demolition waste, which can be used in different applications. It includes construction outputs or wooden pellets. It's often found in sorting centers, landfills, but sometimes also private landowners. The composition of this type of biomass varies significantly as it's a lot of waste. And so the difficulty here is that it can require some pretreatment or sorting to exclude certain types of products. And finally, we have agricultural residues. So these include vegetative debris, manure, soiled animal bedding, composting residues, and so on. These tend to be good for fast pyrolysis, which produces less biochar, but typically more bio-oil products. So that brings us to the next slide, which gives us an overview of the types of technologies that are already commercial today. And so with the help of JICA, one of our partners on this project, we surveyed biocarbon technology producers in the US, Canada, and Europe. What we find is that pyrolysis is the most common type of technology found on the market today. And this is followed by gasification and finally torrefaction. However, what's interesting is that hydrothermal technologies are already much more prominent in Europe than they are in North America. And so this is a trend that we might see coming into North America over the next decade and helping to diversify the types of production processes and biocarbon products that we see on the market. So I'll move on to the next section now regarding market opportunities for biocarbon, as well. We'll cover both the current opportunities and take a look at future opportunities as well. So in the table below, we're looking at the current market for the three types of biocarbon we talked about. And what you may notice is that solid biocarbon is by far the largest product, and it also has the largest projected growth rate in the short term. So its market value by 2030 could reach about $2 billion. Nevertheless, there still are important challenges in order to achieve this market growth. So firstly, the acquisition of biomass resources is often challenging. It's expensive, labor intensive, and certain types of biomass require considerable pretreatment. In addition, we often speak of waste biomass, and so the treatment required can lead to reliance on other plants for the co-processing of the waste. Secondly, biomass to some degree competes with incumbent, well-established and economically superior industries like oil and gas. So in terms of direct competition, it could be in terms of replacing certain products like coal or natural gas in boilers or kilns, also in terms of metallurgy applications. And even in areas where it doesn't compete directly, the scale of the industry is just so small in comparison that, of course, cost effectiveness is one of the challenges today. And therefore, scaling of the industry may help in the long term to achieve more cost competitive products. Next slide. So we're going to take a deeper look now at the variety of possible end uses for the three different types of biocarbon. So we'll start with the solid category. Biochar, most commonly today, it tends to be used in the agriculture industry for soil improvement. So it improves water retention, for example, and nutrient content. It's also often sold or used to create credits on the voluntary carbon market. So that's the VCM, which is an important opportunity for biochar. And then in terms of its material applications, it can be used in metallurgy as a reducing agent, for example, in iron and steel. It can be used in construction, mainly as an additive for cement. And then there are some maybe smaller applications in animal husbandry, horticulture, as well as filtration systems. Biocoal, on the other hand, is focused on energy applications. So biochar is really for material applications and sequestration of carbon, whereas biocoal is for energy. And so this can be used in power generation, industrial heat, as well as in cement and metallurgy for certain heating applications. The challenges associated with these products, specifically for biocoal, is that it's still an early stage market. And for one, it competes with fossil products like coal itself, where cost competitiveness can be an issue. And secondly, in terms of feedstocks, it's competing for the same feedstock as wood pellets. And wood pellets are quite a big industry in BC today. They tend to be exported. In fact, BC represents 76% of Canada's wood pellet exports. And so the cost competitiveness of the export market for wood pellets in Europe and Japan, for instance, is one of the issues to be aware of when thinking about feedstock accessibility. However, there's definitely a lot of opportunity for solid biocarbon products. In terms of sequestration, the estimated removal of the carbon cycle could be between 100 to up to 1,000 years. And secondly, in terms of biocoal, the benefit is that it's a direct substitute for coal, whereas other types of products like wood pellets might only be able to be partial substitutes. Moving on to the liquid products. So these mainly consist of wood vinegar or bio-oil. Wood vinegar is already used in agriculture as a growth agent and an insecticide. Bio-oil can be used as a replacement fuel in certain applications, replacing heavy fuel oil. So the applications are somewhat limited, but a wider application for bio-oils might be to upgrade them to renewable transportation fuels, which allows them to be used as drop-ins. The challenges for liquid biocarbon is that currently, while there is some already in production, it often uses plastics and rubber tires as a feedstock, so this is less sustainable than biomass, of course. And the other challenge related to upgrading of liquid biocarbon is that it contains higher contaminant content, so higher levels of oxygen and higher levels of water, which means that it requires different catalysts compared to what oil refineries are used to upgrading today. However, there is a lot of opportunity for liquid biofuels. In particular, they have a potential on the voluntary credit market to create avoidance credits, for example, through renewable diesel or gasoline production. And in BC in particular, there is the low carbon fuel standard, LCFS, which could be a very good mechanism to help support this type of biocarbon application. Finally, we have the gaseous bioproducts. So these, so this is syngas mainly. So syngas can be used directly in certain applications for industrial heat, but otherwise it can also be upgraded to renewable natural gas and used as a domestic heating fuel. And it can even be liquefied into other types of fuels like ammonia, methanol, renewable gasoline, and so on. Right now, the challenge is that it's still very small scale, and so there's a lack of economies of scale. And therefore, to further expand the opportunity for syngas and gaseous biocarbon, it may be necessary to provide some further incentives to scale RNG synthesis, for example, through renewable gas mandates or regulations. So it is worth taking a moment to look further into the voluntary carbon market. The interesting thing right now is that when looking at this market globally, from a global perspective, biochar is actually the leading carbon dioxide removal delivery method on this market. So in terms of what this market is, there are both, I would say, challenges and opportunities. So in terms of the challenges, there are varying levels of demand for these credits because it is voluntary, of course. It depends to a certain degree on regulatory changes or perception of how those regulations might evolve. It also depends on the reliability associated with the monitoring, verification, and reporting of the credits. And this is particularly important for biochar because it is relatively less known and new on the market. And so there is maybe a lack of knowledge associated with the verification of the credits. There is a large opportunity here, though, for businesses to use carbon dioxide removal to offset their emissions, specifically for businesses that might have difficulty doing avoidance instead. And so the two main components of the market are purchases and deliveries. So deliveries are the verified tons of CO2 that have actually been captured and stored. And for biochar, it's interesting because right now those numbers stand at about 7% for purchases, but 93% for deliveries. And so this can indicate that there's currently some oversupply on the market in terms of the biochar credits. And if this goes on in the long term, there's a risk to depressed prices. So there's definitely a need for better buyer education and policy signals as well. And the other thing that could help is to integrate carbon dioxide removal into compliance markets. Nevertheless, there's a lot of promise for biochar on the CDR market because it is competitive compared to other options. So the price of biochar credits is around $188 per ton, whereas something like direct air capture or DAC is priced above $700 per ton. So once this market starts to gain more importance and interest, there's definitely going to be potential for biochar as a lower cost credit opportunity. In particular, it's important to note that the Ministry of Environment and Parks in BC is working on having biochar being integrated into an offset protocol, which could eventually allow to use these credits in the OBPS market in BC, so the output-based pricing system for industrial emitters. Next slide. So in terms of where the market stands in Canada today, Canadian production is around 260,000 tons of biocarbon per year right now, but there is a lot of activity going on. So when we count projects that are under construction and projects that are announced, we see that this number could climb all the way to 1.2 million tons per year in the next 5 years. The production of biocarbon tends to be concentrated in the foremost forested provinces of Canada. So in the west, that's BC and Alberta, and in the east, Ontario and Quebec. And if the different projects that have been announced actually do come online, BC would be projected to become the largest producer in the next few years. So that is pretty exciting. And I'd like to note some of the projects in BC. So recently, the RBO's project came online at the beginning of the year. It would be producing 50,000 barrels of bio-oil per year, which makes it the largest hydrothermal liquefaction facility in the world. And it's important to note that it was developed in partnership with Indigenous communities, as well as with support from NorthX itself, as well as the Initiative Agreement Program as part of the LCFS in the province. The other project that's worth mentioning is Global Biocoal Energy, which is not online right now, but if it were to come online in the next few years, it plans to produce 360,000 tons per year of biocoal and biochar, which would be a big contributor to the biocarbon industry in the province. So looking more towards the future now and the opportunity for biocarbon, we can see here that there is a large opportunity gap. And so that gap is represented between a scenario that represents current policies versus a decarbonization scenario, which we'll talk more about in the next section. But in 2025, we could already be at about 420,000 tons of biocarbon production in BC. Looking into the future, if we consider current policies and technologies that are already at high maturity, long-term market growth is more limited. But with the right policy support and more advanced technologies like fast pyrolysis and declining costs for slow pyrolysis, growth of biochar remains very strong and could reach about 1.8 million tons per year by 2045. In the medium term, the results suggest that in both scenarios, there is growth. So at least a doubling of production by 2035, representing an annual growth rate of 7%. The other interesting change that we foresee in the market is that today, the mix of biocarbon is largely focused on solid products, whether that be biochar or biocoal. But by 2035, the share of the different products is already projected to evolve. So the share decreasing for biochar, whereas it increases firstly for syngas, followed by bio-oil. And after 2035, the market size and the mix really, again, depends on the different policies that will be in place, how technologies develop, and of course, the availability of low-cost feedstock. So moving towards the opportunity for biocarbon as a decarbonization solution, I'd like to introduce the framework that we used for this evaluation. Next slide, yes. For this study, we used ESMIA's NATEM model, which is a techno-economic optimization model. We used it to evaluate the potential for biocarbon in direct competition with other fuel types. And this is a cost optimization model. So it is the least cost solution that will be selected from an economy-wide perspective. NATEM actually includes thousands of technologies because we model the entire energy chain. So we start from energy production to conversion to end use, including all sectors. So whether that be industry, buildings, transportation, and so on. And we compare with other fuel types. So biocarbon is placed in direct competition with other low carbon fuels, so to say. So that could be electricity, hydrogen, other ways to produce biofuels, and so on. The two main scenarios that we evaluated, and I'm going to briefly just introduce them because you'll see them in the next slide. So there is the REF, which is a reference case that includes all the committed policies that affect the energy system in BC and Canada today. And then we have NZ-BC. So this is a net zero policy scenario where BC would achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And on the right here, I invite you to look at this diagram in further detail in the report, but it kind of highlights how the biocarbon chain was modeled in NATEM. And we highlighted here in terms of the different scenarios that we looked at, what we see as being high certainty production types or end uses versus medium certainty and low certainty. And so I'm going to walk through some of these results in the next slides. Firstly, when we look at the consumption of biocarbon, we find that in a decarbonization scenario, biocarbon consumption increases already by 3x by 2035 and 8.5 times by 2050. So very strong growth potential. And the interesting finding is that biochar is still the most utilized biocarbon product. So less than today in terms of its proportion, but still 54% in 2050. And by 2050, biochar production could reach 2.4 million tons per year in a net zero scenario. The main uses for biochar are sequestration. So in particular, using biochar as a soil additive in agriculture, but also other emerging uses. So this could be, for example, mining soil reclamation, and mining is an important industry in BC, as well as an additive in cement. The cumulative sequestration for biochar between now and 2050 could reach about 45 million tons or 4.7 million tons per year in the long term. The other interesting finding, so we evaluated its potential in the voluntary carbon market as well, specifically in the reference case. And so we find that with projected costs, growth in the voluntary carbon market is important in the medium term. But for the net zero scenario, the biochar needs to stay in BC in order to ensure that BC achieves the sequestration benefit associated with the biocarbon. So looking at the other types of biocarbon, liquid and gaseous, we found that both of these can also be key contributors to decarbonizing specific sectors. So bio-oil could be a key contributor for the transportation sector. Upgrading of bio-oil could supply 10 billion liters of renewable diesel, or in a different scenario, 10 billion liters of renewable jet fuel. And so this could lead to cumulative emission reductions anywhere from 3 million tons to 30 million tons by 2050. I know that's a very wide range, but it really depends on the life cycle carbon intensity that could be achieved for these different renewable fuels. So the low range is a very, very conservative assumption, whereas the high range would be more optimistic, low carbon intensity. Nevertheless, it's important to note that the production of these bio-oils does require some development of fast pyrolysis capacity, which tends to produce more liquid bioproducts, as well as investment in upgrading facilities, which are at a relatively low TRL today. So firstly, improving quality of bio-oil will be important in order to ensure easier upgrading. Looking into how bio-oil production can be integrated into refineries and co-processing, and so that presents some challenges in terms of catalysts, for example. Looking into new markets for biochar, so we briefly mentioned some emerging applications for biochar, but because it is a byproduct of bio-oil production, These two are kind of linked together in that sense. And finally, there could also be some opportunity to inject bio oil as a sequestration solution. And so we didn't focus on that in this study, but it's worth mentioning that there is some interest in other jurisdictions. Now, focusing on syngas, the main application for it is in industrial heating, where in certain cases it might be able to use directly, especially when it's integrated on site, like for example in pulp and paper mills. So the potential for this is around 300 petajoules by 2050, and around 74% of that would be upgraded to RNG, which allows it to be used in a much more diverse set of applications. So the GHG reductions here could be anywhere from 7 to 16 million tons of CO2 by 2050, again, which would depend on the carbon intensity of the life cycle process that is achieved. So it's already being adopted today, but as was mentioned, the existing incentives are not sufficient to recover the cost, so some further support might be required there. And then it's worth mentioning that for industrial heat, there are some applications for solid biocarbon as well. So we talked about biocoal and torrefied pellets, which can be used as a replacement for coal and coke for their energy use. But what we find in the modeling results is that using biochar for material sequestration of carbon tends to be much more valuable than to use solid products like biocoal for their energy applications. So in both of these scenarios, we see that there's a significant investment required in the biocarbon industry in order to deploy this new production. In terms of production technologies, we see a lot of investment in, or continued investment, we can say, in slow pyrolysis, which is already at a high TRL. But with the development of more advanced technologies like fast pyrolysis, this could help for the bio-oil sector, for example, and also gasification to ensure that there's some diversity and production of syngas. Some enabling technologies will be required as well, so to ensure that higher moisture content feedstocks can be used, ensuring better moisture control, as well as innovation of processes to use some of these biocarbon products, and in particular catalysts for upgrading. The other important point will be to incentivize the use of different types of feedstocks, focusing mainly on forest harvest residues or slash piles, which can be left in the forest today, and also to think about what type of pricing can encourage domestic use of feedstocks rather than export of these products to other markets. In terms of the risks for biocarbon, there definitely are some market barriers, which include social licensing and therefore building public support and knowledge around what is biocarbon and what are its benefits. Some barriers around technological development, specifically for advanced technologies, as well as the economic viability and the scaling of the different processes. And finally, of course, we know that access to affordable feedstock can be a challenge. And so thinking about wood processing plants waste and how those can be made more accessible to the biocarbon industry will be important. So I'm going to wrap up the presentation with a brief overview of the action plan. So in order to achieve the full potential for biocarbon, we propose this plan that consists of 6 key themes and objectives. To begin with, the first objective is economic reconciliation. And so we suggest that biocarbon projects near Indigenous communities should enable and recognize Indigenous leadership or equitable participation through partnerships. And a great example of that is the RBO's Biotech Chuntaguna project, which I mentioned earlier, that is based in Prince George. Second, to build on the carbon sequestration potential of biocarbon, we believe it will be important to support pilot projects and research, for example, through an industry fund, to develop emerging high-value applications for biocarbon. So in order to really develop the 2 revenue streams for biocarbon, one being carbon credits and the other being really material applications like in agriculture. But we need more of these applications to ensure that biocarbon is cost-effective, because the volumes used for sequestration are really quite significant. So some of these industries might be mining or construction. We believe that policy support will also be required to encourage the development of carbon sequestration solutions. And so, for example, the offset mechanism and being able to use biochar as an offset under the OBPS or also advancing LCFS policy targets, which will provide further support for bio-oil upgrading. Looking at decarbonizing transport, there are some improvements that will be required in order to commercialize the technologies that are needed, and this will require research and industry working together. So one is hydrothermal liquefaction that allows to use wet feedstock, so kind of a greater diversity of feedstock supply. And another one is microwave-assisted and catalytic pyrolysis. These processes are still at a lower TRL today, but they're able to produce higher quality bio-oil as well as biochar. Looking at decarbonizing heat, we suggest to prioritize options that offer a short payback period. For example, biomass gasification for on-site integration in industrial heating, as has already started to be done in certain pulp and paper mills, and also maybe in cement calcination. In terms of the investment required and encouraging the investment that's needed, we believe that prioritizing long-term contracts for biocarbon applications will be helpful in providing more certainty. So this might be for agricultural soil amendments in industrial heating, or potentially in RNG grid injection, as well as bio-oil upgrading, for example, to supply the LCFS. And in addition to continued investment in slow pyrolysis, we find that investment in fast pyrolysis will be essential to build up long-term capacity. At the same time, investing in new catalyst improvements to ensure that bio-oil upgrading is feasible. And finally, we mentioned access to reliable feedstock a number of times. And so this is definitely a key factor in the economics of biocarbon. And so here we suggest that implementing financial incentives that would make removing forest harvest residues more economical than leaving them in the forest or burning them would be helpful. So this might require, for example, some thought about how stumpage rate calculations can be restructured. And essentially, we are aiming to achieve a biocarbon price in the range of about $45 to $60 per ton in the short term. So finally, to wrap up the presentation, we started by discussing how biocarbon is produced and the feedstocks that are available. We looked at the current market applications for biocarbon, as well as the future outlook and how these applications may develop. And finally, we discussed how biocarbon can be a key contributor to BC's decarbonization targets. So to close the opportunity gap that we saw, the action plan, which is laid out in much more detail in the report, so I encourage you to take a look at it there. It will help to lay out the steps to build a sustainable, flexible, and efficient biocarbon industry. So thank you. I'll pass it back to Ashley, I think, to moderate questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anna. That was a fantastic summary of the report. So as Anna mentioned, you can learn more details in the report itself. We've also included a lot of appendix information on regulatory conditions, life cycle assessments, and other key aspects. But because we're all here together, this is a great opportunity to ask any questions that you might have, whether you've had the chance to do a deep dive into the report or not. So if you have any questions, we've seen a few come through so far, but please go ahead and put them into the Q&A area and we can go through them for the next 15 minutes here. So the couple that have come through already, Anna, maybe I'll just kind of start on the feedstock side. So a really quick question, just in terms of clarification, is the $45 to $60 a ton feedstock cost referencing green or BD basis, so bone dry?
Sorry, I'm not sure I fully understand. What was BD?
I think it's bone dry. So is it green or is it dry?
Oh, right. It references green because we included the drying of the feedstock as part of the modeling of the processes for the production of biocarbon.
Perfect. And then in terms of additional feedstock questions, there's a question here. Can you explain what was the definition used for availability of feedstock? So is it residues that today are not used by any facility or any process? And then there's a subsequent question there, so maybe we'll start with that piece of the question.
So availability considers what is used and unused, and we looked at different sources. I know that we looked at the Ministry of Forestry website to gather more detailed data about forest harvest residues. And so in that case, for example, we don't just have one volume at one price. We actually have built out a pretty detailed supply curve that includes the different locations of where those forest residues are, and the fact that extracting certain residues might be more cost effective, so they come at a lower cost, but then the further you go, for example, or due to the lack of roads, then extracting those residues might be at a higher cost. So yeah, it includes all types of residues.
Fantastic. Yeah, the second part of the question was there any consideration done about how far the residues are from processing facility versus economic feasibility to use them in different biocarbon products? And the answer is yes, definitely a lot of consideration about that. So I think that's great. In terms of the voluntary carbon market, can you expand on the VCM prices for fuel substitution? The attendee is curious as to why the price is so much higher than biochar and the source of that data.
Yeah, are you referring to slide
I think it's
20?
slide
I think
20,
with the
yeah.
chart. Okay. Um, So VCM is projected to show short to medium growth, and so there is a projection of the price increasing in the short term with a higher demand. But for the other biocarbon products, their price, so those are more the material applications, so to say, there is a projection that those prices would decline as the supply of biocarbon is projected to increase substantially over the next 2 decades. And the source for this data is GECA, so GECA. They are a consulting company specialized in biocarbon markets. So yes.
Fantastic. And I can just see a couple questions coming into the chat. So just a reminder, if you're looking to ask questions, please use the Q&A function. In terms of, if we kind of continue on the credit side of things, how does the high supply of biochar-based removal credits align with the lack of quality credits in the market? There's a note about how it's well known that buyers often point out the lack of available quality credits.
Yeah, I'm not very well familiar with the credit market, but when we looked at this, we're looking at the global market. That could be maybe a point of contention as to why the deliveries are so much higher than the purchases. It's true that the quality of the credits is like one of the challenges right now, especially because certification can depend on like soil quality, for instance. And so I think this is definitely one of the areas that still need more work and represent one of the challenges of the industry today.
Absolutely. And I think just kind of following on to that in terms of quality, there's a question here where some critics question the long-term durability of biochar for carbon storage, especially compared to methods like mineralization. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess that's why the range that we cited is very large. So we cited 100 years to 1,000 years. I think, again, it depends a lot on the conditions in which it's sequestered, which leads to the variability that you're mentioning. And so in one type of soil, the sequestration benefits might be very high, but in another type of soil, that might be relatively low. And so even for agricultural producers themselves, I think that might be one of the challenges they face, that even if they try to do everything they can, they're not always getting the expected benefits that they would have liked to get.
Yeah, 100%. Can you go over again the statement about biochar for carbon sequestration being more valuable than biocoal for energy production specifically?
Yes. So in this case, so we're using our optimization framework. And the important thing is that we're optimizing in a net zero scenario. So in this type of scenario, it's a very challenging scenario because achieving net zero anywhere, whether it be BC, Canada, or anywhere, is just a very difficult constraint in and of itself. And so when you think about this kind of scenario, you really have to use each resource to the best of its potential. And the fact of the matter is that there are other alternatives for energy. Of course, not all industrial uses can be electrified, but some might be able to use biomass directly. Some might be able to convert to renewable natural gas, which might be produced in other ways. And so, however, there's always a remaining part that cannot be converted to low carbon fuels. So those emissions that are left over, like process emissions in industry. And that's where the value for biocarbon really comes in, because it's a cost-effective sequestration solution. So it's able to offset those emissions that just can't be avoided in any other way. And I think that is probably the main reason why the value is higher for sequestration, whereas to use it as like to combust it in some type of energy application for heat, for example.
Absolutely. In terms of one of the questions here as to how you can get the report, it's available on our websites and on the NorthX website. Maybe I'll just ask someone from our team that's on the call just to pop the link in the chat. But it is publicly available, so you're welcome to download it and dig into it more there. And as I mentioned, we'll be putting this recording of the webinar up on the website as well. So if you want to take a look through the slides again, we'll have them available for you. So no fretting there. In terms of maybe shifting over to the technology side a little bit, considering the growth of hydrothermal carbonization technologies in Europe, do you think there's a potential in Canada to adopt these for alternative products? So for example, HTC lignin as renewable filler in tires. What are your thoughts there, Anna?
I would probably direct you to the appendix of the report, because we've laid out like maybe about 100 possible applications for biochar. And unfortunately, I just don't have them all in my head. But I think this is interesting, and we certainly didn't model each and every emerging application. It would just be too difficult, and it's also very difficult to predict the value for each market and to model that market explicitly. So that's why in the modeling we kind of had a general like emerging applications category. But if you do look at the appendix report, you'll find like much more detail on what all of these emerging applications might be. And I mean, certainly this could be an interesting one. And I think any application that has a high volume, like tires probably, is a good one, because we really need to focus, I think, on high volume applications to build the scalability required.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the appendix is an absolute goldmine of information, so we invite you to check that out. For solid biocarbon products, the report seems to focus on biochar and biocoal, but some of the literature uses the term biocarbon in the context of metallurgical biocarbon specifically. Is that product category captured under biocoal in the report? And is there a particular reason why it is counted as one product category rather than separate?
I believe it would be, that's a good question. It might be biocoal. It's a bit of a tricky area, because when it's used in metallurgical applications, its primary use is as a reducing agent. So it could be seen as a material application to some degree. But on the other hand, it's often being used for heat at the same time, and it might be combusted. So it would fall probably under the category of biocoal, I would say, even though it's like kind of a gray area between the two.
I would agree. Was any analysis specific to biochar from hydrothermal liquefaction, so hydrochar, completed? And how does hydrochar compare to other biochars?
Yeah, we didn't actually focus on this one specifically in the modeling. From what I know, it's less stable than the other forms of biocarbon, and so it has less direct applications. I think in general it needs to be upgraded to be more valuable. So yeah, it wasn't the main focus of the analysis.
Here, how much CO2 will BC need to remove each year in order to reach net zero, and what percentage of this removal could be provided by biocarbon production?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have the results in front of me, but I did mention on one of the slides the 2050 potential. It's definitely on the order of around 5 million tons. I don't know exactly, but I would guess that it would be a significant proportion of the total negative emissions. So maybe somewhere around 50%, but I would have to check. If it's really interesting to you, I could look it up later and get in touch.
Absolutely. And that's a good point as well. If you have any other questions that come up after this, you're welcome to reach out to us. And really, in terms of short-term carbon removal and negative emission technologies, biocarbon showed really high promise through this report. So definitely a significant potential there. In terms of the next question, you stated that current biochar production in Canada is approximately 260,000 tons. In your results, you indicate that by 2025, BC could produce 420,000 tons of solid biocarbon. Is there more clarification that we can provide on this?
Yeah, so the projects that we were modeling were BC Biocarbon, Canadian Agrichar, Clean Industries with a K, as well as, so the large jump, let's say, in the production is related to the Global Biocoal Energy Project. I think the information is more confidential, but if it were to come online, it would be a very significant project leading to that big jump in production.
100%. And then there's a follow-up question on how do you plan to supply the necessary feedstock to sustain this level of biochar production, more than 6 times the current production?
Yeah, it's definitely well, it's a good question, and it's going to be a challenge, I think. So we did cover some of the different sources of feedstock. There are definitely some that are higher quality than others. I think wood processing plant residues are probably the most easily accessible, but on the other hand, they also have other off-takers already. And so that's where there might need to be some sort of financial incentives to use feedstock in BC itself rather to allow its export in the form of other products, possibly. On the other hand, for the other categories, again, might need some changes in regulation. I mentioned very quickly at the end stumpage rate calculations. Depending on how those are configured, they can either increase the cost effectiveness of leaving the residues in the forest versus actually picking them up and selling them to someone as a higher value product. So it's not easy for sure. And then when you look at the other categories, then the quality of the feedstock itself can be an issue. So requiring processing. Again, I think that because the quantity of low cost feedstock is somewhat limited or it has competition for other uses, I think that the development of certain policies or regulations may be needed to help encourage its use for biocarbon or just in general.
Absolutely. And the last piece of this question is if more biomass is harvested from forests, it will inevitably impact land use dynamics and carbon stocks, potentially reducing carbon sequestration. How did you count this in your analysis? And maybe that leads into a bit of a broader just commentary on the assumptions and everything that went into the modeling.
So we didn't model land use dynamics in this study, but we have done it in others. The general assumption here is that biomass is neutral from a CO2 emission perspective, and that's like the assumption that's used in the National Inventory Report. And so our model is calibrated with the National Inventory Report for historical years for each province. However, just going back to how it would impact carbon stocks or reduce carbon sequestration, it's important that when the feedstocks we're talking about are generally like waste products that are being produced regardless. So they're like the leftovers from logging operations. And so if the logging industry continues with its current level of activity, we're kind of going to have these products anyhow. And so it becomes more of a question of what do you do with them? Do you leave them in the forest where they decay or where they can potentially cause forest fires? Or do you remove them from the forest and use them for these higher value applications that allow to actually sequester the carbon securely in the long term?
Absolutely. And I'm just conscious of time here because I can see there's a couple more questions rolling in, but we have reached the end of our webinar today. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and for your engagement. We really appreciate the questions. For the ones we didn't get to, or if you have any additional questions, please email either NorthX or ESMIA using the emails on the screen. We would be more than happy to follow up with you. As mentioned, the webinar will be available on our website. You can also sign up there for a newsletter, future updates, making sure you're staying in the loop. The insights shared in this report are just the beginning. So at NorthX, we're continuing to build on this work with a new report focused on the potential for drop-in low-carbon fuels, which will be released publicly in September. So please keep an eye out for that. And ultimately, we look forward to continuing the conversation and working together to accelerate climate solutions that are practical, scalable, and reflective of local realities. So thank you again. We hope to connect with you soon and really appreciate your time. Cheers.